The aim of my talk today, really, it's got more to do with basically condensing various rants that I've had in pubs with various people in the cloud community over the last couple of years into one condensed rant of 30 minutes about how customers do due diligence and how cloud vendors represent themselves. So a little bit about myself. I work for one of the UK's largest software as a service vendors. Not going to mention their name because I'm not here to pitch. I'm here to tell you my experiences in the sort of cloud security arena. But we are the second fastest growing tech company in Europe. So we're quite successful as a European company. I'm talking mainly from a SaaS perspective. You'll see that one of my slides is talking about the fact that the cloud is a very all-encompassing term, and in fact it seems to encompass everything at the moment, from hosting vendors all the way down to actually dropping something as a private cloud on your own premise. But my perspective is software as a service, because that's the background that I've come from. Every month I conduct dozens of risk assessments from customers, so I get some idea of what customers want, what they expect, which are sometimes not always the same thing. And also my background is as an ISO 27001 lead auditor before I joined my current company. The other thing is, as always, these are the opinions. These are definitely my opinions, not that of my employer. You know, do not try these stunts at home. I'm a trained professional and all that kind of thing. So, as I said earlier, one of the interesting things is the definition of cloud computing. Cloud computing actually was in place long before anyone tried to define it. So one of the largest and most sort of trusted definitions was created by NIST and then taken up by the Cloud Security Alliance. What you tend to see is it's got the three elements: the service model, like how it's delivered, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, private cloud, the essential characteristics, elasticity, and then the deployment model, blah, 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 blah. The problem with this is that the definitions are so broad that almost everything is a cloud. So when you start talking about cloud due diligence and cloud computing, and you start to get to people like Anissa writing a very good document of considerations customers need to take into account when they're reviewing the security of a cloud service provider, the problem is it's a very broad set of guidance. And customers read this, you know, Anissa document that's 40, 50 pages long, and they go, oh, I don't know, what am I buying? Platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. So part of the problem is cloud computing is being used by all sorts of vendors to pitch their products. So if you look at virtualization, it's no longer virtualization, it's now a cloud enabler. And whether that's you're a service provider or whether you are actually deploying products on premise. So this is a part of the problem that we really have to define what part of cloud computing you're assessing the risk on. So, I mean, the inevitable thing is that people are moving to the cloud. It's happening. You know, even governments are looking at it now. But I tend to see cloud customers as like worried parents. It's the first time they've ever got a babysitter in. Yeah, and they go out for a nice meal, they want to enjoy themselves, and then they spend the whole time on the phone to the babysitter going, is the kid all right? Is the kid all right? You know, is he all right? Has he got to sleep? Has he eaten? And things like that. So they want all the benefits of cloud computing, but then they don't stop worrying about their data in the cloud. And that's even after they've done a hideous amount of due diligence on the cloud provider. So the first thing I'd say for anyone that's considering going into the cloud, is it really sensible? You know, classify your data, and if you're never going to be happy with it not being on servers, you can go and kiss and hug and cuddle and see nice flashy blinky lights. Don't put it in the cloud. Don't waste my time, you know, and a day of my time filling out a due diligence questionnaire if you've deliberately loaded it so that I will never pass your due diligence. Let's just, you know, kiss, make up, hug, and go in two separate directions now. So really, that is the most important thing. Classify your data. What's its sensitivity? What's its criticality? You know, what's your RTO and RPO of it for an availability perspective? And, you know, what would happen if it was breached? Because that sets the tone for the amount of due diligence that you should do on the cloud service provider. So we all know that well-governed organizations make all decisions, you know, taking into account risk. The fact that it is the business people that are mainly making the decision to move to the cloud because they've got some photos on Flickr, and they suddenly think it's a good idea to put all their corporate data in the cloud. But I mean, I was at the first UK Cloud Security Alliance meeting the other day, and there were probably 200 people there, and there were 3 cloud vendors. There were 120 consultants from KPMG and Accenture and everyone else telling us how the perfect world should work. But the problem is, it's not really how businesses work. So we all know how many organizations are well governed. We may work for one, or we have worked for one in the previous business. The reality is most organizations do not really make all of their decisions based on risk and a balance of risk. So that's one of the things that I'm going to go into. So you've made the decision to go into the cloud. The business people have made the decision. The problem with the business people that are running the business units that hold the budgets is they don't know anything about the technology. So they don't know about the risks involved in those technologies. So who do they go to assess the risk of the service provider? They go to their IT team. And their IT team don't really understand risk. They're not risk management people, they're security people. We keep everything secure. We stop external attacks. What they don't do is look at how much risk is there in what we're currently doing on premise and how much risk does this service provider provide us. What are the different kinds of risk and what is the balance of risk between the two of them? What they do, as I'll talk about later, is they count the amount of controls they've got on premise and then go to the service provider and say, can you provide those controls? Which doesn't really tackle the risk. So, as I mentioned earlier, they like to be able to go and see servers. This guy, the IT risk guy, probably comes from a network background. He likes to have kit. He likes to see it, and it gives him a nice warm feeling in his stomach. The other thing is, these guys are the ones that are going to be made redundant by cloud computing. So the people that are doing the risk assessment of the cloud vendor are the people that's going to be made redundant if you move to the cloud. Now, I don't know if that would tarnish your view of the person that you're supposedly independently evaluating, but in my experience, it does. From dealing with a lot of these people, no matter what you tell them, the answer is not the right one. The other thing is about it is due diligence is incredibly expensive. Now, I'm not expecting you as a customer of cloud services to really care how much it costs me to do it, but the more time I spend answering due diligence questionnaires and audit questionnaires, the less time me and my staff are actually protecting your data and assessing the real risk to that data. And this is just to give you an indication of our current level of customers in the UK is 4,000 customers, 1 million subscribers. So the average due diligence questionnaire that we get before someone buys from us, and we're onboarding a couple of hundred customers a month, takes 2 hours to complete. Our average audit on our existing customers takes 6 hours, which may involve travel to and from one of our data centers to give them a tour. So with 4,000 customers, that is 3,000 days of due diligence. Our current growth rate is 7,500% over the last 4 years. So I'm estimating at this current growth rate, I'm going to have a staff of 40 people within 3 years just to do due diligence from customers. It's not scalable. This just does not work. And every single piece of advice you see from everyone is do due diligence and audit on your cloud service providers. Well, if you want to do that, the cost of cloud services are going to go up to cover that human cost of answering those RFPs. Unless, of course, you'd like me to take operational staff off securing your data, that is. So one of the things to get around this is to look at certification. And, so I usually get asked, are you ISO 27001 certified? Yes. Go to end of questionnaire. I'm signed off. I've got a tick in the box. Now, I spent enough time being an ISO auditor to learn that ISO 27001 means nothing unless you look into what the service provider is telling you. So the first thing is scope. There is not a single software as a service vendor in the UK that includes their service platform in the scope of their ISO 27001. Our major competitor only has their HR and finance department covered by their 27001. So all your data is being moved around networks and handled by people which have not been included in the information security management system. Check the scope from anyone who's giving you a 27001. The other thing is, I can define my level of acceptable risk. So as a business, I can go to the board and I say, how much acceptable risk are we willing to take? Well, we're a young startup company growing fast. we may be willing to take £30 million worth of risk a week. That means I can accept almost every risk and still get an ISO 27001 certificate saying my security system is working. So make sure your risk is your risk is the same as the service provider's level of acceptable risk. But what I tend to find about 27001 is they're not actually interested in 27001 at all. They're interested in how many controls are on your statement of applicability. If you don't know and you're not involved in the compliance side of things in the 27001, there's a standard to say you're managing a security system, and then there's a set of controls which are not obligatory, which you may or may not use from a sister standard called 27001, 27002, sorry. And there's 133 of these. Just to give you some indication, our statement of applicability has 128 of those 133, which is why we're not certified yet, because that's a horrific amount of controls to put in. But our customers, what they tend to do is they will just send us a list of 27002 controls and go, which ones do you do? And then they will take a percentage of that 133, and that will be your success score for whether you're chosen as a vendor or not. And that's completely artificial, because some of those relate to e-commerce, for instance. We don't do e-commerce. So, you know, some of them relate to outsourced software development. We don't do outsourced software development, so we get an X in that box straight away. So 27001 is great to work out if a company has a security system in place for managing security, assessing risk, and things like that. But it's not a great standard to actually work out what risks your data are facing within that operator. There's another standard we usually see, SAS 70. Now, SAS 70 can be actually quite a good standard, but the way most people use it, it isn't. So SAS 70, what you literally do is you write control statements. So it's up to you. You can write whatever you want. So I can write a control statement about how we onboard employees, how about we review access control. I can choose whatever topics in a security scope that I want a control statement. Then an external auditor comes in and just makes sure what I'm saying is true. It's good standard from that perspective, because I could literally write a statement about every single one of our 27002 controls, and then you would see how we're actually doing them. So it gives you a little bit more transparency about how we're doing things internally, and you get the fact that an auditor's come in and audited it. The problem is most SAS 70 only relates to a very limited subset of controls, which are defined in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, because the requirements to conform to SOX 404 controls requires a SAS 70 statement. So if you're a listed US company. So the fact is SAS 70 is used in the wrong way, really, if you're a UK company or a global company. It's very US-centric as well. And it's being removed soon and being replaced by the stamped addressed envelope sort of standard. I don't know what it is. SAE. So the thing is, we've got these two sort of standards that people are using as yardsticks to test this, and they really don't work. So what we end up actually doing is answering a very long RFP from every single customer about every single possible control, some of which are completely inapplicable for us. So I just want to give you some examples of some of the things that I've seen. So one of the questionnaires I typically get is, how do you limit physical access to your data centers, where my data will be? And then the same questionnaire, they'll say, can I do a tour of your data center? So, and as I mentioned earlier, a footfall of 3,000, you know, or 3,000 customers a year doing an audit on our data center. You don't want those walking through your data center. So the thing is, and they go, oh, can't you just do it for us? You know, and everyone asks, can't you just do it for us? So the thing is they're asking things and they're expecting things, and then what they want to do is completely contradictory to what they're asking for. So it's not really security they're after this, you know, they haven't really thought about what they want. This is another real-life example. I spent 45 minutes on the phone to a customer. We have a proprietary distributed filing system that works on a grid, which has inherent encryption. And I spent 45 minutes with this guy drilling in to how does our key rotation work? How do we do that? How do we manage our keys? And then I just stopped at one point and I said, so what do you do currently? Are we back up to tape? And is that encrypted? No. And what do you do with the tapes? Oh, we take them off site. How do we take them off site? in the back of the IT manager's car. And where does he keep his car overnight? On his driveway. So the guy's quizzing us for 45 minutes about how we use AES encryption and how we do key rotation, yet at the moment he's taking his backup tapes, which are unencrypted, and leaving them in the back of a car on a driveway overnight. So the thing is what they've actually got to get is, here is the current level, their baseline of what they've got as security. All they need is that much better, and it's a solution. But they're asking us questions about out here. What you've really got to do is base your level of risk on what you're currently doing on premise, and then decide whether the service provider offers more or less risk. And if he provides more risk, are there contractual controls or other controls, or asking for more transparency that will bring that down? Or is the cost saving so great that it's worth taking that extra risk? And that is a business risk management decision, not a security one. So I've started to turn the tables a little bit now. So when I get an RFP from a customer, I send him a questionnaire. And I say, how do you class, there's a lot of confidential information in this RFP, information about our infrastructure, our processes, our IDS vendor, our IPS vendor, how we do vulnerability analysis. So I send them a questionnaire. I say, how do you classify our RFPs? And they go, we don't. Hang on, you've just sent me a questionnaire about classification and how we do it internally. Okay. How many people have access to my completed RFP within your organization? Oh, we don't know. We put it on a file share somewhere. Okay. Does anyone print this out and review it? Oh, yeah, people print it out. How do you ensure they dispose of that RFP with all our confidential information? Oh, we don't. So this customer is saying, we're going to outsource one of our business processes to a service provider, and we have this expectation of security, yet all our internal processes are completely utterly screwed up. So they are thinking that we represent the greatest amount of risk to them in their overall. So, typically, we're an email service provider, is what we do, archiving and continuity, that kind of stuff. And most of the systems we're connecting to probably could do with a little bit more improvement in quite a few number of situations. And actually, they represent much less risk moving to ourselves. But the thing is, because this mindset is around has to be secure, every single possible thing has to be done, yet when they're doing stuff on premise, they don't have that same level of expectation, which is very frustrating for myself. So who have we got to represent us in this challenge we face as service providers, that ISO 27001 doesn't really work and SAS 70 isn't really the right kind of standard? We have the Cloud Security Alliance. If you're going to InfoSec tomorrow, they have a summit at InfoSec. Now, if you look at the member page of the Cloud Security Alliance, there's not a single cloud service provider on there. They're all infrastructure vendors. So as a member of the Cloud Security Alliance, I feel more like a prospect than I do as being represented. So infrastructure vendors, and if you look at things like Cloud Audit that has now been merged into the Cloud Security Alliance and CAM eventually, that is heavily represented. In fact, its chair works for Cisco and VMware. And surprisingly enough, you tend to find that virtualization takes quite a heavy place in all of the Cloud Security Alliance's materials. If you look at their guidance, the 2.1 guidance, I think virtualization is mentioned a couple of hundred times. Well, you can build a service platform without any form of virtualization at all, with proper multi-tenancy and everything else. In fact, it's what we've done. It's based on a couple of thousand servers, and we built our own platform. So the problem is the vendors have too much of an invested interest in the fact that they're on-premise. If you look at us, we replace roughly about 8 servers on-premise with our service. So you see these infrastructure vendors, their profits going down as people move to the cloud. So they're looking at new ways to reinvent themselves. And that's by embedding themselves in the cloud providers. You must use virtualization. You must do that. And the other thing is the invention of this whole idea of the private cloud. I haven't got a slide on this, but I've got enough time to quickly touch on it. And that is, I mentioned earlier that there's this amorphous term, the cloud, that covers everything. And there are different tiers of the cloud. As you go through the software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and then private clouds, they have different levels of abstraction. With software as a service, everything is abstracted. Hardware, software, expertise. because you're typically replacing a single horizontal solution in your business, CRM, accounts, or in our case, email, with one service in the cloud. So everything is abstracted. And as you start to move down those layers, you take on more and more responsibility until you get to a private cloud, which isn't really a cloud at all. It's virtualized on-premise products. But cloud sounded good and it had some buzz. So virtualization vendors created this idea of a private cloud. I actually have this other presentation that starts off where you have different types of clouds in the atmosphere, and you gradually work closest. And the one closest to the ground, closest to what you do at the moment, is fog. And that's how I look at private clouds. They're fog, because you can see through them. They're not transparent. There's no abstraction. You see everything that's working in there. You're just taking hardware complexity and making it software complexity. And from a security perspective, virtualization, you've got 8 products. Looking from an email perspective, if you virtualize those, you've now got 9 products, or 10 if you look at the host operating system with the hypervisor. You've got the hypervisor itself. You've now got 10 administrative interfaces, 10 chances to do misconfigurations and everything else. Virtualization doesn't really change, solve the problem. It just changes its nature slightly. So what do we need? As I mentioned earlier, software as a service is largely about replacing very specific horizontal solutions within the business. So in our case, email, as I mentioned, CRM, if you go into salesforce.com, NetSuite for things like accounts and resource planning and things like that. What we really need is an ability for companies to baseline what they're doing, right? So they can use a traditional qualitative or quantitative risk assessment process to work out how much financial risk their current solutions and controls and risks that they face present them. And then what they need is a way to assess the risks of the service provider, and those risks will be totally different. So the standard risk assessment models and the threats you look at are different. When you go to a cloud provider, we have different risks that we represent. Some are the same ones, some different ones. So it allows you to do that balance. You can work out, will I have more risk, will I have less risk, and what's the differential? And are there controls, contractual, like I mentioned earlier about the transparency, to try and bring that risk down. Unfortunately, what we're getting, my friends, the Cloud Security Alliance are up there again, these are different cloud industry bodies. And I have to point out, when I made that diagram earlier with all the vendor logos on them, it's pretty much the same across all of these. Vendors dominate all of these infrastructure vendors. So now, all of these have come up with their own standard for evaluating the risk of a cloud in a cloud environment. The Cloud Industry Forum has, Eurocloud has. Some of these are external audits, some of them are self-assessment questionnaires. One of the best ones I've seen so far is actually CAM, which Cloud Audit has been merged into. So what they're all coming up with is their own standard. So now I expect most of my customers to still be sending me RFPs, RFIs. I now have to certify to SAS 70 ISO 27001. I have to complete the Cloud Industry Forum self-assessment questionnaire. I have to do the Eurocloud external audit as well. My situation is not getting better, and having all these different standards is not helping the customer either. So I understand that because now everything's a cloud, there's a large chunk of things that all these industry bodies can start getting their teeth into. But personally myself, I'd like to see something like the Cloud Security Alliance taking on the responsibility of security from all these other ones, but it isn't going to happen because I'm members of all of these, and yeah, they're never going to come together. So here's my plea. So I've got about 4 or 5 minutes after this for any questions from my perspective. But first thing is, if you're a customer, look at your current risk. What are you doing on premise? What is your pounds, shillings, and pence figure for the amount of risk you're exposed to with what you're doing on premise? Then forget about what the cloud service provider is doing. Do a complete audit of that cloud service provider, either by going through their statement of applicability or their control statements in SAS 70, and then do a risk assessment on that service provider and get the same pounds, shillings, and pence. And that gives you 2 figures, cloud, on-premise. Then look at the differentiator. Is there more risk, less going to the cloud? What controls? This is standard like risk assessment and risk management 101 that you do in an organization. But the thing is, people don't do it. They just throw a questionnaire at the cloud service provider and don't really do anything apart from go from the person that's ticked the most boxes when it comes back. The other thing is, if you want champagne, expect to pay for it. So the other thing is, if you want to come in and audit me every year, don't expect to have a cost saving on top of what you're currently doing. Yeah? The cost saving, because my overheads have gone up, and I have to pass those overheads to the rest of the business, which means the cost of our service goes up. So that means the motivations for going to the cloud, which is almost predominantly at the moment not about managing complexity of on-house solutions. It's not about focusing on core business. Remember going back to my first slide about companies really don't govern themselves very well. It's all about saving money. So, what you need to do is, if you expect, the earth, expect to pay for it. And there are tiers of cloud service providers in the software and service arena. So we have people we compete with which are very much commodity products. They're consumer products, some of them from very large vendors with multicolored logos. But the thing is, you get what you pay for. And we're more expensive, and we didn't decide to go down a race to the bottom. We decided to maintain, that level and standard of security, but we won't drop our prices. But then again, don't expect, all 133 questions to be ticked exactly as you want unless you're going to pay for it. So, look at the price of a cloud service provider and what you actually need, and then take that decision based on, are you paying over the top? Because I don't actually need this level of security. So you could go to one of those commodity services. If my CEO ever sees this presentation, I'm dead. So the industry bodies, as I said, I wish they'd come together and just come up with one standard for audit. The other thing is, I wish they'd represent both the customer and the service provider, not the person trying to sell stuff to the service provider. And cloud providers, we need to embrace transparency. So I've got a project on the moment to try and give customers metrics about how the system that they're actually on is performing and sort of things like that. I think there's a lot of cloud providers are very cagey about giving you information. And there is some information I won't give you because it's related to our intellectual property and how we build our grid and things like that. But there are other things I can give you to compensate for the fact that I can't disclose that information. So if a cloud provider isn't telling you something, it could be because they can't afford that overhead if you're asking a very specific question, but they should have prepared in advance a set of standard answers to all the sort of usual queries that you get. So that is, in effect, my rant. My rant is customers don't really assess the risk properly in cloud service providers. They use the wrong standards for doing it. They have unreasonable expectations a lot of the time. And the people that are supposed to be representing us and giving us a much better solution to this aren't really representing us. They're working out ways to sell products to us so that we can maintain where we are and not actually get any better at doing this. So if anyone's got any suggestions on how to make this better, I would gladly take them, because like I say, I'm a member of the Cloud Security Alliance as well, and this is actually something that I've proposed to them as something they need to be considering as a work area within the UK.